All right, welcome back everybody to the deep dive. As always, we're diving right in, no time wasted, and today we are going to be looking at the Russian kettlebell.
Yeah.
Specifically through Pavel Tsatsouline's book, The Russian Kettlebell Challenge, right? So the book itself is kind of like a pretty interesting mix. It's got some history in there, some training methodology, some kind of surprising applications, at least to me.
Right.
So let's just dive right into it. I think our goal today should be to kind of extract from this book what exactly makes kettlebell training unique. What makes it, what makes it effective as a way to develop yourself physically, and what are the key principles there. So I think a good place to start is just the history of it, right? Like, where do these things even come from?
Yeah. So it's pretty cool. The book talks about the kettlebell as like the working class sport of Russia. So, these weren't things that were developed in some like, high-end gym or a lab. This was something that was very much integrated into their culture and their life.
And it was a sport, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it wasn't just casual.
Absolutely.
There was like a competitive aspect to it.
Yeah.
Kind of from the get-go, it seems like.
Yeah. The first competition was held in 1948. And the way they measured the kettlebells back then was in poods, which is like a Russian unit of measurement for weight. But yeah, they had standardized competition weights and all that kind of stuff. And Pavel himself actually achieved a national ranking in this sport.
Oh, interesting. Wow. So, okay. And then, it seems like there was like a resurgence of interest in this much later.
Yeah,
like,
big time.
Big time in the 70s.
The 70s. Huge in the 70s, yeah. It really took off, to the point where, like, it says here a lot of the Soviet republics, they made it like an ethnic sport by 74.
Oh, interesting.
And then in 85, they had the first, like, USSR National Zhirovoi Sport Championship.
Zhirovoi, so that's the name of the actual, like, sport itself.
Right, yeah.
And like a Jirovic is somebody who competes with kettlebells.
Yes.
I see. Okay. And it even says that, like, back in the day, like in Tsarist Russia, that any strongman, like, even if they didn't use kettlebells, they would still be called like a Jirovic or a kettlebell man.
Right.
So it's interesting how that was like the terminology that was just used for anybody who lifted weights.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, it wasn't just in Russia, though, right? Like in the early 1900s, it seems like kettlebells were pretty popular in Europe and America even.
Yeah, they were.
Like Arthur Saxon, right?
Yeah, you had guys like Arthur Saxon using them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he was a big dude, and he liked to use all kinds of different implements, so it's not surprising. But it seems like, the West kind of got a little soft, as the book puts it, and kind of lost interest, whereas Russia, continued to use them and develop their training methodology.
Right. Right. The book says that the West, was getting prosperous and soft, and Russia, they didn't have that, that privilege, so they had to keep using this stuff.
It's funny because it even quotes a Russian magazine, Hercules, from back in 1913, where they talk about the fact that the West is kind of going soft and Russia's like, nope, we're still doing our thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and if you look at the competition format, fixed weight, high reps, it's all about, just grinding it out. And the two main lifts are power clean and jerk, and the one arm snatch. So it's really about like rugged staying power.
That's interesting. It's a totally different mindset, I think, than a lot of, like, the way that lifting is done in the West.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like even powerlifting is so much about, like, you get 3 attempts, and it's a very different thing. So they've got these cool stories too about these old time strongmen.
Oh yeah.
Like Pyotr Krylov, the king of kettlebells. I mean, this guy was jerking like 2 soldiers overhead while they were sitting in hollow spheres. Like, that's just
crazy.
And then there's Mors Nemensky,
Yeah.
who would do a handstand on 32-kilogram kettlebells and then jump back to his feet and press them overhead 10 times.
Oh.
Just like crazy stuff. So obviously these guys were strong, right? But beyond just the anecdotes, like what was the Soviet scientific community saying about the use of kettlebells for development?
Well, Soviet science really considered it one of the best tools for all-around physical development. And there's a study in here by Voropayev, and then you've got the Lesgaft Physical Culture Institute, which is in Leningrad. They did a big study on it in 1986 and basically confirmed that kettlebell training does all these things.
Right.
Increases strength endurance, general endurance, work capacity, even improves balance. And Professor Medvedev, who's, obviously very well respected, he called your voice sport like this amazing way to develop strength, endurance, and strength coordination at the same time, which, you don't really see in a lot of other sports.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's a pretty comprehensive list of benefits. So, for somebody out there listening who's looking for a well-rounded way to train, this is definitely something that you can get a lot out of.
Right.
And they even found that like there was a correlation between how well somebody did in kettlebell lifting competitions and how well they did in all these other fitness tests.
Yeah.
Power lifts, grip strength, pull-ups, dips, even running the 1,000-meter run.
Yeah.
Work capacity tests, balance tests, all these things. So it seems like kettlebell training really does have this carryover to just general athleticism.
For sure. And, it's one thing to just say, this is good for strength, but when you actually see that it correlates with all these other markers of fitness, it just shows that it's really developing something, deeper, more fundamental.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I found really interesting was how they applied kettlebell training in the military.
Yeah.
Right. So the Red Army, they adopted kettlebells for every military unit.
Every unit.
Every single one.
Yeah.
And it seemed like the Navy especially was really into them.
Yeah, they were big fans.
And the reasoning for that, it makes sense. Strength, endurance, both those things are critical in combat situations.
For sure.
And there's a huge emphasis on cardio, right? Like the book talks about unparalleled cardio benefits.
Yeah.
So, you're doing these high rep cleans and jerks and snatches, and it's kind of like the equivalent of doing 20 rep squats in terms of the cardio demand.
Oh, yeah. And the Spetsnaz, the Russian special forces, they really attribute their wiry strength, their explosiveness, their stamina, their ability to never quit, like all that kind of stuff, they attribute it directly to their kettlebell training.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And the Soviet Armed Forces Manual even said that kettlebell exercises are one of the most effective ways to develop strength, and that it's like this new era in the development of human strength potential.
It's pretty cool.
Which is a pretty bold statement. So, moving on from the military side of things, in combat sports like wrestling, for example, what kind of role did kettlebells play there?
Well, it seems like Russian wrestlers, they would use kettlebells a lot for conditioning, because the movements are so ballistic, it's got a lot of carryover to wrestling.
It's like the explosiveness.
Yeah, exactly. And the cardio is huge, just like we were talking about before. And there's even this part where they compare the one-arm snatch to Hindu squats.
Yeah.
And they basically say that for certain aspects of conditioning that are relevant to fighting, that the one-arm snatch is actually superior. And then there's this other cool thing about how kettlebells can strengthen your respiratory muscles. And they talk about Professor Laputin, and he had this special breathing shrug that he would do.
I see. Okay. So for somebody out there who's maybe never heard of this, what does that even look like?
So basically you take a deep breath in as you shrug the kettlebells up, like you're trying to get your rib cage to expand as much as possible. And then you exhale forcefully as you lower them.
Okay.
And then you just repeat that, for a high number of reps. And that's going to build your grip endurance, but also your respiratory strength.
I see. Now, hands and wrists, those are obviously very important in combat. So how do kettlebells, impact those areas?
Kettlebells are amazing for developing powerful wrists. Like they talk about boxers being able to maintain their punching power for longer because of the strength and endurance that they get from kettlebell work. And there's even this cool drill where you do military presses with like a light kettlebell just hanging off your thumb.
Oh, wow.
And that's supposed to like strengthen your thumb against like jamming injuries and stuff like that.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so it's really about building that specific strength in the hands and wrists. And the official kettlebell lifts, they actually develop this ability to absorb ballistic shocks, which is huge for any sport where you're taking impacts. And it also builds strong tendons and ligaments in your wrists, elbows, shoulders, back, all that stuff.
That's interesting. So is that like kind of like a built-in injury prevention almost? Like
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And they even say that, for developing power, that kettlebells are actually better than plyometrics in a lot of cases.
Oh, wow.
And they even say that, unless you've got access to a really good coach, who's trained in Eastern Europe, that kettlebells are probably a better choice than barbell Olympic lifts for most people who are trying to improve their power.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, it is.
I mean,
Yeah.
that goes against, a lot of what you hear from a lot of strength coaches.
If sure.
And there's this cool thing about kettlebell throwing that they talk about for punching power, which is kind of wild.
Yeah, they talk about this guy, Steve Justa, who's a strength trainer, and he would have his guys toss a kettlebell in front of their hips to build what he called tremendous wrenching power.
Hmm.
So, if you're in a sport where you need to be able to generate that kind of power, like a combat sport or something like that, the kettlebell is hard to beat.
All right. So we've talked about, how kettlebells are useful for people in physically demanding professions, combat athletes. But what about people who are just, lifting weights, like weightlifters or arm wrestlers? Like, how do kettlebells play into that?
Well, it's pretty cool because the book points out that a lot of the famous Soviet weightlifters, like you've got Vorobyev, Vlasov, Alexeyev, even Zabotinsky, like all these guys, they all started with kettlebells.
Really?
Yeah, like Zabotinsky even talks about like his early experiences lifting a 16-kilogram kettlebell with his friends, when he was younger.
That's wild. I mean, these are like the titans of weightlifting history.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just when they were kids, right? Like they
Yeah.
continue to use them.
Right. Yeah, even at the elite level, Olympic weightlifters, they were using kettlebells for things like improving their shoulder and hip flexibility, doing swings and laterals and all kinds of like rowing type movements and throwing drills.
Yep.
And this guy, Rudinov, who's a Russian weightlifting expert, he came up with some really cool drills for leg strength using kettlebells. Like he had this one-legged kettlebell front squat.
A one-legged kettlebell front squat.
Yeah.
I mean, that's got to be like ridiculously hard.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then, they also talk about kettlebells as a way to overload, certain movements. Like there's the kettlebell Satz press, which is like super hard.
Okay.
And overhead kettlebell squats, they help with hip and lower back flexibility, which is important for powerlifters.
Mm.
And then, Dr. Fred Hatfield, who's, a big name in the strength world, he even recommended using kettlebells as a form of complex training within a weightlifting program. And they talk about Steve Wilson and how he used kettlebells in his deadlift routine. And then there's this other guy, B. Philip Workman, who got really good results using a similar approach.
So it sounds like, for those athletes, it's not necessarily replacing the barbell work, but it's more like like a supplemental, like an addition.
Yeah.
That helps with those little, those other qualities that maybe the barbell work isn't hitting as well.
Exactly.
And what about arm wrestlers? What are they getting out of kettlebells?
Oh, arm wrestlers, they love kettlebells. Like the book quotes this world champion arm wrestler, and he says that kettlebells are amazing for grip and forearm development. And Rodionov, who we mentioned before, he also came up with some drills for arm wrestlers, specifically to strengthen the wrists and the fingers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Grip strength is huge for arm wrestling.
Oh, yeah. And then, guys like John Brookfield, who's like, a grip legend. He's a big fan of kettlebells.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dr. Fred Hatfield said, the best grip exercises are always going to be pulling at heavy weights ballistically. So, things like high rep snatches, those are going to build incredibly strong fingers. They're going to work your forearms like crazy. And that's exactly what arm wrestlers need.
Yeah. Okay, so we've seen that there's, a lot of benefits for strength athletes. But what about health and longevity? Like, does the book talk about that at all?
Oh, yeah. They actually talk about that a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Like they talk about this doctor, Dr. Kamsky, who says that he actually reversed his aging by 20 years thanks to kettlebell training.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then there's this other guy, Vasily Kubanov, who overcame a disability and was able to reach a national ranking in kettlebell sport. So it's pretty amazing.
That's pretty incredible.
Mm.
What about injuries?
Well, they talk about a lot of cases where people have rehabbed from back injuries using kettlebells. Like they've got this crazy story about this guy, Valentin Dikl, who broke his back and then went on to deadlift 460 kilograms, which is just insane.
Wow.
And he credits a lot of his recovery to kettlebell exercises. And there's also some talk about how kettlebells can actually improve joint health, because of that repetitive ballistic loading.
So it's not just about like building muscle.
Right.
It's about, making those joints healthier as well.
Yeah. And they cite some research from Rukashansky and Sif, and then this other guy, Swanepoel, who found that that cartilage can actually adapt positively to regular impulsive forces, which is kind of what you're getting with kettlebell training.
That's interesting. So, I mean, this is a totally different approach to joint health than what a lot of people are used to.
Right.
Um, and then they also mentioned Dr. Len Schwartz, who did some research on panaerobic exercise, which is basically combining hand weights with dynamic movement. And they say that it has similar fat loss benefits to kettlebell lifting.
Yeah.
And there's this guy, Jason Clower, who talks about how like his metabolism went through the roof when he started training with kettlebells almost every day.
Right.
So it seems like there's, all these benefits, not just for strength, but for overall health, for fat loss, for joint health.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so the book, it also gets into the specifics of how to actually train with kettlebells, right?
Right.
So they talk about the program minimum, which is like the basics, the foundation, and then the program maximum, which is more advanced.
Right. And they say that the program minimum, which basically focuses on the one-arm snatch and the bent press, those two exercises alone are enough to prepare you for a lot of different physical challenges.
Wow.
And then the program maximum gets into, all the different Russian training programs and the guidelines they use.
Okay, so what are like some of the key principles that they highlight in those programs?
Well, they talk about frequency, like how often you should train. And that can be anywhere from 2 to 7 sessions per week, depending on your goals.
Okay.
The duration of those training sessions, how long they are, and then, of course, exercise selection is huge. And they talk a lot about circuit training, how to use it effectively.
Yeah.
And then, rest periods, like how long you should rest between sets.
Mm-hmm.
That really depends on whether you're training for strength or for endurance.
Oh, interesting.
And the difficulty and the intensity of the workouts, they have to be varied, right? If you want to keep progressing.
You can't just do the same thing over and over again.
Right. You got to keep your body guessing. And they talk about like rep ranges for different types of exercises.
Okay.
Like, presses are going to be lower reps, ballistics, you can go a little higher. And they also talk about tempo, the speed at which you do the exercises.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of those programs, like what kind of specific drills and techniques are they detailing?
Oh, all sorts of cool stuff, like the snatch, the under the leg pass, the jerk, the clean and jerk, the military press, the side press, the bent press, like you name it, it's in there.
Oh, wow.
And they even talk about group training methodologies that they would use in the Red Army.
Oh, interesting.
And even the Russian Navy SEALs, they would train underwater with kettlebells, which is just wild.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And they talk about the ladder technique, or lesyenka, which is the Russian word for it. And that was actually inspired by Hermann Gerner, the strongman. And basically the idea is, you're increasing the weight for a certain number of reps and then maybe decreasing it or starting over with a lighter weight.
Yeah, you kind of like you go up a ladder and then you come back down or you go back up again.
Right. And they also really emphasize the importance of not training to failure.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So they talk about the rep ladder as a preferred method, especially for the Russian special forces.
Okay, yeah, the rep ladder, where you're basically increasing the number of reps that you do with a given weight.
Exactly.
All right, so it's not just about the exercises themselves, but also about the way that you program them and the way that you execute them.
Right. It's a whole system.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's good to kind of touch on some of the specific exercises and just highlight like what makes them unique, what makes them beneficial, just to give the listener a little bit of a taste.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they call the one-arm snatch the czar of kettlebell lifts.
Yeah, it's like kind of the flagship lift, it seems like.
Right.
And it does seem to hit like so many different things at once, like power, coordination, cardio.
Yeah, it's a full body exercise for sure. And then, the bent press, which is an old-time strongman favorite, that's amazing for developing your lats.
Well,
The military press, they talk about doing it with a really strong brace. They call it the aptyazhka technique, where you're basically creating tension throughout your whole body to stabilize that lift. And that's, a key lift for shoulder strength.
now the swing, that seems to be like kind of the basic movement.
Right. Yeah, the swing is the foundation.
Yeah.
It works like pretty much every muscle in your body. And then you got the clean, which, they emphasize keeping a proper wrist angle so you don't hurt yourself. The jerk, where you're using your legs to drive the kettlebell overhead.
Mm.
And that was a technique that Hackenschmidt, the famous wrestler, he was a big fan of.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got the jump shrug, which is this really explosive movement for developing power. The windmill, which is good for shoulder strength and flexibility, and then the Satz press, which is like this really advanced exercise that requires a ton of shoulder strength and hip flexibility.
Yeah, just hearing those names, like the bent press and the Satz press, and yeah, all these different, like, it conjures up this image of like old school strength and like real dedication to the craft.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, for somebody who's thinking about getting into kettlebells, what are like some of the practical things they should keep in mind, like some of the guidelines or considerations that the book offers?
Well, first of all, form and safety are super important,
Yeah.
The book actually tells you to be ready to drop the kettlebell if you lose control of it.
Yeah, which I think is good advice.
Yeah. And then they talk about breathing techniques, Generally, you want to inhale during the easy part of the movement and exhale during the hard part. And then warming up and stretching are essential, obviously.
Of course.
And Pavel recommends his Relax into Stretch program as a good resource for that. And then, you really want to tailor your training to your own needs and circumstances.
Whoa.
Like they talk about how, in the military, they would adapt their kettlebell training based on, the mission that they were going on or the environment that they were in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Yeah, okay. Now, there's these two concepts that I wanted to touch on that the book mentions: high motor density and fatigue specificity.
Mm-hmm.
So in the context of circuit training, what do those things actually mean?
So high motor density basically means doing a lot of work in a short amount of time.
Okay.
And fatigue specificity refers to the idea that you're going to fatigue more quickly if you're doing the same exercise over and over again, as opposed to doing different exercises that work similar muscles. So with circuit training, you can actually do a lot of volume without hitting that local muscular fatigue as quickly.
Okay.
And then, they also emphasize the importance of varying your training load and intensity over time.
Yeah.
And they talk about monitoring your recovery, like paying attention to your heart rate and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they also say that kettlebells are great for both solo and group training.
Yeah. And they even had a method for measuring the intensity of your training based on your competition performance.
Yeah, this guy, Voropayev, he came up with this system where you measure your training intensity not just by how much weight you're lifting, but as a percentage of your best performance in the competition lifts. So it's a more individualized way to gauge how hard you're working. And then, for beginners, they have some advice from this guy, Alexander Felemev, about like how to choose the right weight, how much volume to do, range of motion, breathing, rest, all that stuff. And then they even give you like a sample workout from Steve Maxwell. And then there's some stuff from the Soldier Be Strong manual, which gives you like concrete examples of how to structure your workouts and how to, make them more challenging over time.
All right. So before we wrap up, are there any like myths that the book debunks about kettlebells, or any like unique advantages that it highlights?
Yeah, they talk a lot about how kettlebells are different from dumbbells and machines.
Okay.
Because with a kettlebell, the center of mass is offset, which means that it's going to challenge your stability and your coordination more.
Right.
And they talk about how kettlebell training builds functional strength that you can actually use in real life, and explosive power and endurance. Yeah. And they say that it's not about building like this purely aesthetic physique.
Yeah.
It's about building a physique that can perform. Like they even reference the statue of Hercules by Laurent Delvaux as an example of like the kind of physique that kettlebell training can develop.
Yeah.
And then, they also talk about how kettlebells are cost effective and space saving.
Yeah.
Which is huge, right? I mean, you don't need a whole gym full of equipment to get a good workout.
Yeah. They're very portable too. You can pretty much take them anywhere.
Exactly.
Now, going back to that program minimum, like what are the core benefits that somebody can expect to see just by consistently practicing those basic exercises, the one-arm snatch and the bent press?
Well, they say that you can get a lean physique, you'll develop a strong heart and lungs, a steel back, strong bones, and you'll be able to handle pretty much any physical challenge that comes your way. They even talk about how, like, you'll be prepared for the authentic Russian sport of wrestling bears.
That's a good one. I like that.
Yeah.
All right. So to kind of, bring this all together, We dove into the Russian Kettlebell Challenge by Pavel Tsatsouline. And we saw that there's a really deep history here. There's a lot of scientific backing from the Soviets who took this stuff really seriously.
Yeah.
There's all these different applications, not just for athletes, but for military personnel, for people who just want to be healthy.
Right.
And the training principles themselves are unique and effective, and they really do seem to work.
Yeah.
And this is more than just a fitness fad.
Yeah, it's a time-tested methodology.
It really is. And I think, hopefully this deep dive has given the listener a good understanding of the system and